must start immediately because we are 5 minutes behind schedule.
My apologies. I actually went to the other room.
Oh, okay. The first speaker for the parallel session 2 is Rajiv Bola from the University of Ottawa in Canada, and the title of his paper is Short but Sweet, Eusebius' Refutation of Plato in the Preparatio Evangelica.
Yeah, I'm just going to see if I can.
You want to share something?
Yes.
Yeah.
This does not want to behave terribly well. There we are.
At the bottom of your screen. Oh, okay, it's okay. Okay.
Oh, it's working?
Yes, of course.
Okay. See. I don't see any video. Okay, perfect. Good morning. At least it's morning for me. Just want to say again on the last day, thank you for putting this together and making sure that this conference happened, even with everything that's been going on globally. Appreciate you having me. So I will try to keep this short, let's say. So a bit of context. Eusebius of Caesarea's 15-book Christian apologetic Preparatio Evangelica has received considerable academic attention for its erudite examination of Platonic thought. 3 entire books, books 11 through 13, totaling some 111 chapters, are devoted exclusively to the Athenian philosopher. And out of those, Eusebius spends 103 chapters harmonizing Plato's essential doctrines relating to the supreme deity and the nature of the soul with Jewish scripture, more specifically Mosaic doctrines. Now, to be sure, the purpose of Eusebius's assessment is not, as many scholars have traditionally accepted, to demonstrate that Plato has Plato has value for Christians or to appropriate Plato for Christian use. Rather, Eusebius's argument is that these parallels with Scripture only exist because Plato plagiarized extensively from Moses and Jewish doctrines. So the limit of Plato's usefulness is precisely how closely he reproduced the doctrines of that older and more reverent civilization. So my focus in this talk is going to be really the remaining 8 chapters of Eusebius's demonstration, in which, after detailing at length the many intersections between the doctrines of Plato and the ancient Hebrews, Eusebius addresses the limitations of this agreement, of this harmony, and therefore the potential for Platonic thought to be useful for Christians. So Eusebius's refutation, here we are, Eusebius's refutation in the final chapters of Book 13 remains a curious issue in scholarship for the fact that it's rarely taken into account. Though even when it is, it does little to temper the prevailing opinion that Eusebius viewed Plato favorably and deemed him of value for Christians. So scholars such as Timothy Barnes and Aryakovsky, Michael Frede, Edouard de Place, among others, have regarded the brevity of the refutation as proof of Eusebius's reluctance to criticize Plato, as proof of the insincerity of his invective. And the apologist's grievances, they conclude, are few and trivial and do not detract from his overarching concern for demonstrating the philosopher's merits. So in this paper, I will argue that brief though the refutation may be in comparison to the sheer enumeration of the philosopher's parallels with Scripture, Eusebius's refutation of Plato is in fact a scathing and damaging retort that is entirely in line with his exhortations to the reader that they must abandon Plato along with all other Greek philosophy. So to begin, I'll just offer a few remarks on the first 5 chapters of the refutation, which appear to constitute a singular thematic unit. but that I do want to focus on the remaining three chapters, the last three chapters of the Refutation, which differ considerably in approach to these earlier chapters. And then in my concluding comments, we'll look more broadly at how these two segments may be affecting the Refutation as a whole. So to begin with the first section, which I have here up here on the slide, the first 5 chapters of the Refutation, I'll just offer a few comments on Eusebius's rhetorical strategy. His approach to the various topics typically involves a statement that in these instances, Plato fails to follow in the footsteps of the Hebrews, and therefore he arrives at contradictory ideas. Or not therefore, but he does arrive at contradictory ideas. And with the exception of chapter 18, Eusebius does not rely on scriptural material to demonstrate his point. Rather, he quotes Plato at length and either points to an earlier discussion in the harmony portion of the Praeparatio discussion of Plato to expose the contradiction, or he creates the comparison in the moment, always coupled with his own extensive commentary to show how Plato contradicts himself. And the way he goes about this is varied. And I'll just give a couple of generalizing sort of examples. In chapter 18, the Divinity of the Luminaries, he says that when Plato says that the planets should be worshipped as they should be worshipped as gods, that they are gods, that he is contradicting his own doctrines. When Plato is discussing when Eusebius is discussing Plato's doctrine on the transmigration of the soul, or metempsychosis, he says, first of all, that it's an absurd idea. And he describes it as an absurdity. And he's also incredulous that Plato advances this doctrine, to quote Eusebius, without any proof. And he says that he would like to refute it, but he cannot. There's no occasion to refute Plato because Plato did not himself attempt the problem by way of demonstration. So, speaking very generally there, I just want to emphasize that for Eusebius, the matter is not then whether Plato is in accord with the Hebrews. Rather, Eusebius identifies statements or doctrines that are self-contradictory, instances even where Plato does not live in accordance with his principles, ideas that are absurd or contrary to common sense, and also claims without proof. And these strategies are not unique to Eusebius, but were standard fare in philosophical circles. And while Eusebius acknowledges that he could elaborate on his criticisms ad nauseum, he limits himself to a brief and focused discussion. But in the second phase of his refutation, which comprises chapters 19 through 21, Eusebius takes a slightly different tack. And firstly, he offers far less commentary, preferring to quote Plato at length, but not with the intent of exposing self-contradictions. Rather, he uses the space to showcase polarizing Platonic concepts. Overall, Eusebius limits himself to the Republic, the Laws, and the Phaedrus, and tackles the following topics, which are, at least the first two, fairly well recognized. Secondly, the running theme with one evocative digression, point number 2, or at chapter 20, the running theme seems to be on civic legislation. And we might say Plato's adeptness at steering the ship of state. And finally, towards the end, Eusebius cites some laws of Moses as a contrast to Plato's legislation. But the purpose is not, as has often been assumed, some sort of a priori argument that is accessible only to those who accept the authority of Scripture, but the purpose is to solidify the rejection of Plato by portraying him as a less sensical lawgiver. So to begin with chapter 19, Plato's avant-garde legislation surrounding the social equality of women in the Republic and the Laws are well known. I'll refrain from summarizing that in interest of time. But what's important to note here is that the reader of the Praeparatio, regardless of their social position or religious orientation, when confronted by these ideas, would naturally be unsettled. Especially the sort of elite male audience who would have had enough familiarity with Plato's ideas to be able to keep up with Eusebius's discussion. So I don't think I need to elaborate this point. From a common sense perspective, in an ancient Mediterranean context, Plato's seamless incorporation of women into, let's say, every male stratum forebodes the very opposite of social cohesion. His proposals challenge the status quo, the natural order of society, on several levels. In addition to erosion of social distinctions through these various forms of civic participation, his particular reorientation of the gender divide signals the destruction of the traditional household unit. And Eusebius's goal here is quite clearly to affect a level of discomfort in the reader. And his strategy then is just to layer on quote upon quote. And so 17 passages in total are pulled from the Republic and the Laws for this chapter. In a sense, the apologist lets our philosopher do all the heavy lifting on this one, and allows him the rope to hang himself in the reader's eyes. Eusebius's snapshot of Platonic love in the chapter that follows is a bit of a distraction from the main accusation, which is that Plato is not an effective legislator, but it's worthwhile. We should allow maybe ourselves to be distracted for a moment to observe the interesting way in which Eusebius manipulates the Platonic concept. So chapter 20 is a rather short discussion. Eusebius only quotes 3 passages, all from 255 and 256. Specifically those areas pertaining to the growth of the affection between lover and beloved. However, in the Praeparatio discussion, gone is any mention of erotic divine inspiration or striving jointly to know the good. Instead, Eusebius shines a spotlight purely on the carnal desires of the unruly or the unrestrained horse, and quite literally excises any mention of the opposing horse that represents self-control, moderation, and reason. And I'll actually show how he does that here. So this is the second passage that Eusebius reproduces. This is at 255, not 255 E2. I actually cut this short from the original. But what I want to point out here is the section in bold. In this passage, Eusebius curiously omits 256 A5 to 7, which I have reinserted in this passage and highlighted. And when we remove this passage, it distorts the original. And combined with the other passages that Eusebius quotes, his version of Platonic love has no room and no need for restraint, no need for control. So to try to understand Plato's conception from Eusebius's excerpts alone, one would naturally arrive to at the conclusion that he's endorsing irrationality and mania and madness, and suggesting that this somehow leads to the philosophical ideal. And actually, I'll go back to the survey. But then, yes, towards the end of the chapter, eventually Eusebius returns to the topic of legislation by quoting Leviticus 20:13. That is, if a man lies with a man as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall be put to death. Their blood is upon them. But the intent is not entirely to hold Plato to a Mosaic standard a priori, as if to say Moses says it's bad, therefore Plato is wrong. Instead, Moses' prescription of a harsh punishment sort of begs the question of his reasonability and his qualifications as a lawgiver. And this acts as a segue to the final chapter, where Eusebius begins by reproducing aspects of Plato's laws pertaining to capital punishment and penalties for murder. In the first instance, he quotes Laws, Book 11, 914 A2 to A8, which states, I'll remind you, states that a slave who fails to inform on a theft from Delphi should be put to death, but that this law does not apply to a free man. And in a rare instance of editorializing in these final chapters, Eusebius draws attention here to the evident double standard that the death penalty should be applied to the slave who fails to inform, but no commentary is offered for any of these items, but the running thread speaks volumes. Whether it's someone killing another person in anger, killing a family member in anger, and so forth. Eusebius selects complex examples with mitigating factors. My apologies. And none of them involve the death penalty. And we know that Plato's reasoning for preferring exile to execution is the hope for philosophical rehabilitation, an opportunity to correct the deficiency of the soul that produced the injustice. But the image that Eusebius wants to paint here is that Plato's priorities are askew. They're completely out of order. And by contrast, he introduces Moses' legislation. And the way it's presented is much more straightforward. So he follows up directly on Plato's homicide code with passages from Exodus 21, though only a very select few, and short and to the point. Murder results in execution, accidental murder, there's sanctuary, premeditated murder and flight to sanctuary equals execution, murdering family equals execution, so forth. Slaves are not summarily executed, they're compensated for violence against them, and so forth. But more importantly, in this sense, that Moses's laws on murder are more in keeping with the existing Greek penal codes, and more generally the ancient system of retributive justice. So it's not just more familiar to the average Greek audience, but more sensical. And I think time is not on my side, so I'll just draw some concluding comments. Eusebius only sets aside, let's say, 8 chapters total for his refutation of Plato, but it's far from being a meager discussion. So the significance of the final 3 chapters of the refutation is subtle, but is there. In chapters 19 and 21 especially, Eusebius isolates ideas that are simply too progressive to the point of being socially subversive. And when we join this with Eusebius's peculiar presentation of Platonic love, the result is a panoply of ideas that most in antiquity would struggle to get behind, no matter how much they might esteem Plato's other concepts. And the inclusion of Moses, though it's late in the discussion, is hardly surprising for the Christian and Jewish state leader, legislator, lawgiver par excellence, to stand as a foil for Plato and his utopia. And when we step back and we view the 2 segments of the refutation, the picture comes into focus a little bit more, I think. The survey of Plato's self-contradictions in their myriad forms in chapters 14 to 18 challenge his identity as a dialectician. Meanwhile, the review of his social, civic, and legal policies in chapters 19 to 21 challenge his competency as a lawgiver. And it's these 2 elements that Plato, of course, elevates as the qualities of the philosopher king. And so with the moving parts of Eusebius's neglected argument, it sort of upholds the main accusation of the refutation, and that is Plato only makes sense when he's plagiarizing Moses. But since the knowledge is not his, he's plagiarizing Moses, since the knowledge is not his, he cannot apply it to the construction of good laws for a good state. So Eusebius does not state it outright, but Moses is the philosopher king that Plato postulates. But in order for the reader to come to that understanding in the Praeparatio, Plato must first fail his own test, which is where I think the refutation may very well be the direction that it's going. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajiv. So we have plenty of time for questions, remarks, or discussion because, in fact, there was a short mistake on the schedule, and we divided the session in five, according to 5 participants, and so we have extra time until 5:40. So, are there questions, remarks, or comments? Yes, Sean.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Cool.
Yes, of
Thanks
course.
thanks for the paper.
Thank you.
So when I think of Eusebius, I often think of him maybe simplistically as in the line of origin. But the way that you describe his discussion of Plato in the Preparatio reminds me more of someone like Tatian. So do we have to kind of change how we configure Eusebius in our story of kind of how we get from the 2nd century to the 4th century in Christian sort of interactions with Greek philosophy? Or am I overinterpreting him from this one text that you discussed?
No, well, I mean, it's a funny thing because the temptation's always been there in preparatio studies, and this is, I think, what has sort of steered things in directions that maybe it shouldn't have gone, to align Eusebius with previous thinkers, previous apologists. That there's been this perennial understanding that Eusebius is not an original thinker, and that he's relying on the arguments of that he's a mediocre theologian, and relying on the ideas of better thinkers. But he really does. I mean, the Praeparatio as a whole really sort of speaks to his originality and his knowledge of Plato. He pulls in not so much origin. He has to be a little bit careful with origin, based on the reputation that he has. In the 2nd decade of the 4th century already. But he quotes Clement. He's very well versed in Platonic thinkers. He's quoting Severus. He's quoting Porphyry extensively. Of course, he's familiar with Porphyry. But he trying to line him up with Tatian and Clement and other people who dealt with um, um, Platonic harmonies. It gets a little bit tricky there. Is Eusebius doing something original? I think he is. And has Christian apology grown past the point where they have to appeal to the cultural baggage that converts want to bring in with them? I think at this point, yes.
Other question? Rajiv, may I ask you something?
Of course.
Do you think that Eusebius thought of Plato as an outdated thinker and did not only want to reinforce Christianity, Christian views?
Sorry, what was that last part?
Yeah, I would like to ask if, according to your understanding, Eusebius thought of Plato as an outdated thinker, and he did not attack him only to reinforce Christian religion.
Well, actually, it's a funny thing. Plato has an interesting position, I think, and I apologize. It's heat wave just started here, so it's about 40 degrees in this room. Um, uh, so did he think he was an outdated thinker? Um, I don't get the sense of that. I mean, the reason that he focuses so much on Plato is that he
Yes, let me explain.
okay.
Uh, I would like to know your views about his criticism on Plato. And do you think that he criticized heavily Plato because he thought that Plato's philosophy was not so worthy to his to the time he lived, to the 4th century, 5th century AD, that Plato's philosophy had not so much to offer to the new Christian society in which Eusebius lived?
Right. Well, I don't think he communicates any judgment on that. Really, his the purpose of the purpose of the Praeparatio and where Plato sort of fits in it is that um, Plato is a vestige of a culture that's in decline, whereas Christianity is, let's say, renewal of human civilization. So, by necessity, the baby has to go out with the bathwater, in a sense. And but Plato has very strategic importance for Eusebius. So when Eusebius leans on Plato because he is a very esteemed thinker and because his doctrines align in numerous places with Hebrew scripture. Um, so what he does effectively is, if his reader is coming from a whether they're a new convert or they're a sympathetic pagan, um, coming from a Platonic background, um, he's banking on that authority that they give to Plato. So um, that when he's demonstrating Plato's harmony with Scripture, that authority is being transferred. Plato's authority is being sort of grafted onto onto the scripture. But then it gets to a tipping point where, and this is where we reach the refutation portion, is that um, once that authority is transferred, if you respect this idea in Plato, you have to respect this idea in scripture. And at the same time, he's making the argument that Plato was plagiarizing scripture. Um, Once it reaches the refutation portion, then it's all the authority must be on the scripture. And now here is where Plato's completely outlandish. So you've transferred the authority from one to the other, and now you discard the old. Um, so I think primarily that's whatever Eusebius really thought about Plato. That's how he finds him useful for the point of his argument, is sort of casting off the old dying culture, um, and using whatever authority that he can squeeze out of him to grant authority in the reader's eyes to Scripture.
Okay, thank you very much. And the next speaker in our session is Christian Seelig from the University of Kentucky. And the title of his paper is The Necessity of Moral Virtue for Spiritual Illumination in the Cappadocian Fathers. Christian?
Okay, thank you very much. I would just like to begin by thanking you for having me at this exciting conference. I've very much enjoyed it. So thank you for listening to. Okay, I'll also, before I start, I want to say that I'm not an expert in the Cappadocian Fathers. My research focuses on Plato and ethics in Plato. But I recently have been interested in a theme that I think occurs starting in Plato and, of course, carries through Neoplatonism and early Christian philosophy. And the theme is the connection between purifying oneself morally, developing virtue, and the sort of spiritual, what I'm calling spiritual illumination or insight into the nature of reality that can result. Simply because it seems like, those two things seem disconnected, especially to the modern thinker. I'm teaching Descartes right now to my summer students, and Descartes doesn't talk about the necessity of becoming a good person before you can do his method of radical doubt and so forth. So it was an idea that really struck me as strange, but interesting and illuminating. So for my paper, I'll talk about what I'm doing, the argument in the paper, and then I'll look at two, I think, important passages from the Cappadocian Fathers and give my commentary on them, and then I'll conclude. So, and everyone can hear me all right, correct? Okay. All right, well, so 4th century Christian philosophers, Basil of Caesarea, Gregory Nazianzen, and Gregory of Nyssa, together known as the Cappadocian Fathers, produced work containing some sophisticated Christian developments of ancient pagan ideas pertaining to virtue's role as the purificatory sort of prerequisite for what I'm calling spiritual illumination. So in this paper, I interpret the Cappadocians as collectively arguing that vicious, excessive desires for earthly goods such as pleasure, wealth, honors are mutually exclusive with divine love, agape, as well as the experience of spiritual ecstatic union with God that sometimes accompanies this type of love. I also argue that their treatment of this topic develops primarily Plotinus discussion of the same theme in Ennead 1:2 on virtue, text that's most likely one of their main influences. They develop it by asserting that God assists this process of deification, theosis, by actively granting grace to those who rightly pursue virtue. The Cappadocians characterize humanity as playing, to some extent, a passive role in one respect and an active role in another, insofar as humans must deliberately develop their moral virtue while simultaneously relying on God's grace as a necessary aid. And this is a pretty standard view, of course, kind of evoking the notion of divine synergy, synergeia, that's common, as far as I understand, in Eastern Orthodoxy especially. Okay, so I'll read one passage and talk a little bit about this developing virtue through the help of God as exercise that purifies the soul and prepares it for spiritual illumination, and then I'll talk more about the illumination. Okay, so I'll read one from Basil. Basil's description of the soul's purification process is closely akin to Plotinus's, but he Christianizes Plotinus's account by adding that the Holy Spirit must play a guiding role in any successful process of purification or deification. Okay, so Basil says, "And he, God, like the sun, will by the aid of your purified eye show you in himself the image of the invisible. And in the blessed spectacle of the image, you shall behold the unspeakable beauty of the archetype. Through his aid, hearts are lifted up, the weak are held by the hand, and they who are advancing are brought to perfection. Shining upon those who are cleansed from every spot, God makes them spiritual by fellowship with himself. Just as when a sunbeam falls on bright and transparent bodies, they also become brilliant too, and shed forth a fresh brightness from themselves. So souls wherein the Spirit dwells too are illuminated. shed forth a brightness from themselves. Souls wherein the Spirit dwells, illuminated by the Spirit, themselves become spiritual and send forth their grace to others. Hence comes joy without end, abiding in God, being made like to God, and the highest of all, being made God. So here Basil plays an active role in both stages of the soul's deification. By the way, I think that is from Basil's work on the Holy Spirit. Sorry, I forgot to mention that. But anyway, God plays an active role in both stages of the soul's deification. First, God's aid lifts up the believer's heart and holds it by the hand, implying that God's grace assists humans to realize the perfection of moral virtue if they have sufficient desire for it. Secondly, the purified eye of the perfected soul may, with the active aid of the Holy Spirit once again, perceive the unspeakable beauty of the archetype in an image of the invisible, he says. So God's initial facilitation of the soul's purification subsequently gives rise to its higher degree of kinship with God as inward access to his beauty. I kind of think of this as a snowball effect, sort of like, and I think Gregory of Nyssa has a similar way of describing this effect, that the deeper you go, the more purified you become. The process sort of accelerates like that, cyclically. Having reached this illumined state, the soul may send forth its grace to others, much like God has sent forth his grace to it. The highest stage in this process of growing more similar to God constitutes complete deification, or being made God. But the precise literal intention he has with that statement, I'm not sure. But again, he's evoking this idea of theosis. Okay, so last passage that I'll read and talk about. Having discussed the purification process necessary for spiritual illumination, the Cappadocians talk about the inner experience that I refer to as spiritual illumination that they think the purified soul can undergo. The Cappadocians discuss noetic, mystical, or ecstatic spiritual encounters with the divine that sometimes seize the virtuous person when she practices prayerful meditation or other contemplative activities. Returning to Gregory of Nyssa's On Virginity, we find imagery of light and sight to describe inner noetic or spiritual experiences. He says, I dare say that it is to such a person who has purified all the powers of his soul from every form of evil, that which is alone beautiful by nature becomes evident. Just as the eye is cleansed from rheum, sees objects shining brightly in the distance in the air, so also the soul through incorruptibility acquires the power to perceive the light. The goal of true virginity and zeal for incorruptibility is the ability to see God. For the chief and first and only beautiful and good and pure is the God of all. So I really like this image of cleansing the eye, getting rid of the rheum, I think I'm saying that right, R-H-E-U-M, so that you can see more clearly as, this allegory or analog for purifying the soul so that it may perceive God in these inner experiences more clearly. The light never hides itself. The light, as in God, never hides itself. It doesn't change. Evils just inhibit or obscure the soul's powers such that they cannot perceive it. When the evils are cleansed, like rheum from the eye, the soul becomes truly virgin or pure, and therefore possesses zeal for incorruptibility. Such a person can finally see God, which suggests that she inwardly perceives God with the mind as an overwhelmingly beautiful, permeating presence. And I probably should have mentioned this before, but I'll just conclude by saying, okay, how does this relate to Plato? Of course, I've already mentioned the heavy influence from Plotinus, but places in Plato where one can at least detect a connection between moral virtue as this purifying exercise that leads to some sort of illumination. I'm thinking of Socrates' speech in the Symposium, where it seems like not just anybody can have a vision of the form of the beautiful. It takes, this ascent of the ladder of love that involves, some sort of moral purification. And also, I'm thinking of the Republic, where protreptic education involves turning the whole soul around, developing virtue, all of the virtues. Wisdom isn't something that you can just seemingly jump. You can't just jump straight to wisdom from your place in the cave. It takes a development of the whole soul. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm hoping to hear questions or suggestions, hopefully, that could help me maybe refine this thesis or push the paper further. So thank you.
Thank you, Christian. Are there any questions? Andreas Athanasakis.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Christian, for your talk. At the time you were speaking about spiritual illumination, I was thinking of the word that Plato uses all the time when he comes to find the ideas, and that's the word exephnis. All of a sudden, we see the word keep repeating it in the Platonic dialogues. And first of all, I'm not familiar with the Cappadocian fathers, but did you find any analog with that word and the Cappadocian ones?
Yeah, thank you for your question. My good friend who is here with us, Joseph Mikoski, wrote his dissertation on Exyphnes in early Greek literature. So he's the authority. But short answer to your question is I had not come across that word, nor was I really looking for it. But the, similarity that I see, at least as far as I understand, the way that Plato uses Exyphnes, is that the Cappadocians talk about this spiritual illumination as something that is fragmentary. It's not something that one, can just choose to have and then persist in it as long as you want. It's something that you prepare yourself for, but it's essentially, again, like passive. It's something that happens with the help of God. It's momentary. It's elusive. It's something that, is fleeting. So it seems like maybe I'm thinking of the famous passage in Plato's Seventh Letter where Exyphnes is used. It seems like there's a similar experience he's describing, but that's all I can say. I think it's a great question, and I'd like to know more about it.
I would like to add that Augustine shared the same view, Christian, and he described in a very similar way illumination without explicitly said the word exephnis all of the sudden. But I think that you're right. Even the word is not there. The whole procedure is something that happened all of a sudden when God decides to illuminate you.
Yeah, that makes sense. And by the way, there's a great book. Joe Simikoski published a book on Exyphnes in early Greek literature, if anybody's interested. I think that's the title. Joe, you can correct me if you want, but I think it's The Role of Exyphnes in Early Greek Literature. So anyway.
Thank you. And well, congratulations to Joe. Questions? Other questions? Lela, I think you raised your hand. Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your paper. I just wanted to ask, is there any evidence of Porphyry's quite complicated theory of virtues in Cappadocian texts, or probably not? So with all these levels, intellectual virtues, soul's virtues, cathartic virtues, even paradigmatic virtues, and so on, or probably not, and political virtues too, so, but probably not, yes?
Yeah, I'm not familiar, I'm afraid, with Porphyry's account of virtue, but
yes, you are familiar with Plotinus. It's Plotinus, but a little bit more complicated. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, like I said, all I sort of detected was, you know, from what I'm remembering off the top of my head in Plotinus, there were the two stages of virtue. There's like the initial ones that are meant to purify the soul. Does he call them the civic virtues at times? And then, yeah, then you have the more perfect virtues that have to deal with leading you toward the intellect and the one and so forth. Yeah, so I'm sorry. I wish I could say more about Porphyry, but
thank you very much. I think their moral is more important, these moral virtues, probably, than intellectuals or so. I don't know. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Sean, please.
Yeah, just really quickly. First, I want to join the chorus of applauding not just this paper, but also Joe's paper on Exiphanes from the other day, because I really got a lot out of that too. And I too see a lot of interesting connections to Augustine, you know, Confessions 8 and stuff like that. So that's a cool conversation. Just to push back against it a little bit, one thing I notice in Augustine a lot as well is an emphasis on, whether you want to call it illumination or not, a kind of unveiling that the divine causes to happen to those who have not prepared themselves for it, right? So on one hand, yeah, you do have him sometimes sounding like a Cappadocian, talking about how you have to cleanse the eye of the mind in order to see God clearly. Sometimes God will blind you on the road to Damascus, like he did to Paul, right? When Paul had not prepared himself to receive that intellectual content, if that's what we want to call it. And so I guess my question is, do you see that other side of things also in the Cappadocians, or do they, I guess, emphasize more of the kind of the preparation, purification aspect, and less of the kind of Augustinian violent grace aspect?
Yeah, that's a good question. And if I, were more of an expert in the Cappadocians, I'm sure I could give a better answer. But it seems like there is a definite split, as far as I understand, between Augustine and the Eastern tradition, in that in the Eastern tradition, there is just more of this emphasis on the divine synergy and, the kind of role that humans have to play in this process of deification. And it's not, whereas Augustine seems to have the more hardline predestination kind of looking at way of seeing the world. Cappadocians emphasize the necessity to cooperate in that process of purification, but it could be other I mean, but you're right that seems like there are important places where you have like Paul on the road to Damascus. How would the Cappadocians account for that? I'm not quite sure, but it seems, at least as far as I understand it, that that might be an important point of contrast between the Eastern and the Western tradition at that point in time. But I'm open to hearing more about that.
Can I just say a quick follow-up?
Yes, of course. Yes, please.
Yeah, I don't want to, I was kind of playing devil's advocate. I don't want to make a huge chasm between Augustine over here and the Cappadocians over here. I think there are plenty of passages in Augustine that sound like Basil, especially. And I guess just to bring it full circle back to Confessions 8, I mean, the whole comparison there is with Anthony the Great, right? The Latin translation of a text that, you know, is pretty well known on the Greek side as well. But the weird thing is, even though Augustine has that logic, or he shares a bit of that rhetoric, I guess I should say, of instantaneous transformation, he also notices how he's different from Anthony, right? And all Anthony needs is to be walking by the church of the gospel, and then he radically changes his life, you know, at that moment. Augustine has to go through this long, protracted process of kind of being dragged to God, right? Which, yeah, it does kind of foreshadow some of the predestination stuff, but I think also, I don't know, there might be a fun way we could put it more into conversation with Greek fathers as well, right? So I guess I just wanted to say I didn't want to isolate Augustine over here on his own island, but there does seem to be a bit more of an emphasis on, I guess, the passivity that you mentioned before, but a different kind of passivity, perhaps.
It makes sense to me. Yeah, thanks.
We have time for for one more question. Okay, thank you, Christian, once again.
Thank you.
And the next speaker is Lela Alexidze from Tbilisi State University. And the title of her paper is Falsehood and Two-Facedness Injure the Body and Then the Soul, a quotation from Plato in Rustavelli.
So thank you very much. Many thanks to the organizers and all participants for this very, very interesting conference. And today, quite surprisingly to myself, I shall not speak about a philosophical text or Neoplatonic text, but just about one small fragment from the epic poem, Georgian epic poem, written in 12th century by Rustavelli. And we know the title of the poem is The Knight in the Panther Skin, and we shall try to discuss a fragment where Plato is mentioned and even, so to say, quoted. So one of the main heroes of this, it is very simple, so I have not the handouts. One of the main heroes of the poem, the knight Aftandil, called Aftandil, in his letter to his king, Rostevan, wrote that he should leave the country for a while in order to help his friend to find his beloved lady who had been kidnapped. Aftandil knew that the king was against his leaving, so in the letter he tried to convince him that he made a right decision. Aftandil's arguments, among others, are as follows, and now I quote from this poem in a prosaic translation by Marjorie Wardrop. A wise man cannot abandon his beloved friend. I venture to remind these of the teaching of a certain discourse made by Plato. Falsehood and two-facedness injure the body and then the soul. End of quote. This fragment was discussed in numerous Rustavellian studies. The question was that whether or not Plato really could be the source of the above-mentioned quotation, or it was a fiction invented by Rustavelli himself. The words injure the soul were clear. A bad deed is harmful for the soul in this life and the afterlife as well. But the main problem in this quote was the expression injure the body. If it concerns not only the person who suffers injustice, but the one who causes it too, then how can his body be injured if the one who does something bad behaves in such a way exactly in order to gain something good for himself? Moreover, the context of Plato's dialogues and letters on the one hand, and Rustavelli's poem on the other, testifies that a good man due to his right deeds often risks his life. In spite of this fact, in my opinion, the phrase from Rustavelli corresponds to Plato's philosophy, though it is not a direct and exact quote. I think that both Plato and Rustavelli wanted to ensure the readers and audience that if one harms another man, then it will be bad not only for the person who is harmed, but for the one who harms too, and not only for his soul or in an afterlife, but also being incorporeal during the earthly life. In my opinion, Rustaveli's words, injure the body, mean a person who is still alive. This thought, in a more or less explicit form, is present in Plato's following text, at least. For example, 1, Apology, 2, Crito, 3, Gorgias, 4, Republic, 5, Laws, 6, 7th letter. As for Rustaveli, I suppose he believes that he expressed the authentic idea of Plato. That is why in the following verse he wrote, and here is quote, "Since lying is the source of all misfortunes, why should I abandon my friend, a brother by a stronger tie than born brotherhood? I will not do it. What avails me the knowledge of the philosophizing of the philosophers? Therefore we are taught that we may be united with the core of the heavenly hosts." End of quote. Now let us see which fragments from Plato's dialogues and letters correspond to Aftandil's words. We shall concentrate mainly on some of them and on the first problematic part of the quote, injure the body. First text. In the Apology, Socrates explains to the citizens of Athens that if they let kill him, that means if they do what is unjust, they will harm first of all themselves. And now quote, of course, Plato is not in my translation. "Be sure that if you kill this sort of man I say I am, you will not harm him more than yourselves. I think he," that means Meletos or Anytos, "is doing himself much greater harm doing what he is doing now, attempting to have executed men unjustly." Then, a good man cannot be harmed either in life or in death, and his affairs are not neglected by the gods. End of quote. Thus, according to that, what Socrates says in his Apology, a bad deed can be harmful for those who behave unjustly. Now the second text. In Crito, Socrates tells himself in the name of the laws that if he breaks the law and escapes from the prison, even though he survives, he shall harm himself, because his life in exile will be unhappy and his family and friends will be dishonored. And here, quote from Crito, "For consider what good you will do yourself or your friends by breaking our agreements and committing such a wrong." End of quote. Then the laws describe what kind of bad things can happen in such a case to Socrates, though he survives, his family and friends, and thereafter they tell Socrates, and here quote from Crito again, "If you depart after breaking your agreements and commitments with us, after mistreating those you should mistreat least, yourself, your friends, your country, and us, we shall be angry with you while you are still alive." End of quote. That breaking the agreement, in the case of Rustaveli's poem, agreement with a friend is a bad deed, is one of the main reasons why Aftandil, in this Georgian poem, is sure that he should leave the country and help his friend. Now the text 3 from Plato. The idea that a man who acts unjustly is miserable is expressed also in Gorgias. And here is quote, "I say that the admirable and good person, man or woman, is happy, but that the one who is unjust and wicked is miserable." End of quote. Now text 4. Whether the person who behaves justly has a happy life or not is one of the main themes, as we all know, of the first book of Republic. And here is quote, so Socrates claims injustice makes a person first incapable of achieving anything because he is in a state of civil war and not of one mind. Second, it makes him his own enemy as well as the enemy of just people. Then it follows that a just soul and a just man will live well and an unjust one badly. And surely anyone who lives well is blessed and happy, and anyone who doesn't is the opposite. Therefore, a just person is happy and unjust one wretched. And so injustice is never more profitable than justice. End of quote. And now text number 5. In Laws, Plato claims that it should be even declared that to live justly is more pleasant than unjustly. And here is quote, "It is certain that the unjust life is not only more shocking and disgraceful, but also in fact less pleasant than the just and holy." Interestingly, in laws, the theme of falsehood is also discussed as it is in Athens' Testament. The person who lies loses friends and harms himself. And here is a quote from Laws, "No one has any friends if he is full or cannot be trusted. As the years go by, he is recognized for what he is, and in the difficulties of old age, as life draws to its close, he isolates himself completely." End of quote. And now the last text, number 6. The context of the 7th letter reminds us of Rustaveli's words too. "A bad deed is harmful for a person who acts badly as well as for people around him." And here is quote, "This is the advice that Dion and I gave to Dionysius," that means to have good friends, "since his father's neglect had resulted in his being without culture and unused to associations appropriate to his position, striving by our words to show him that everyone must do this who would save himself and the people whom he rules, whereas any other course will accomplish his ruin and theirs." End of quote. And now a short conclusion. Thus, I think that Plato expressed in his dialogues and this letter the idea which corresponds to the words from Rustaveli's poem, "Falsehood and two-facedness injure the body and then the soul." Rustaveli did not quote Plato exactly, but he adequately summarized the content of Plato's discourses. Certainly, both Plato and Rustaveli expressed a different idea too. The life of a person who behaves justly can be under threat. Both of them knew that it is difficult to convince a person who does not act justly that justice is a virtue by itself, and that a possible danger for a person who acts well is not important. On the other hand, those who act justly for the sake of justice and goodness itself do not need any kind of arguments based on the idea that the life of a person who acts justly will be happy and pleasant. That's why both Plato's and Rustaveli's words that a bad deed will be harmful for a person in his life already who acts badly, and this will happen already in his life, are addressed in a didactic manner to those who do not believe in this thesis or have some doubts. Obviously, both Plato and Rustaveli were well aware that it was impossible to prove that idea plausibly, either by means of logical argumentation or through a sample of empirical cases, but still both of them tried to convince the opponents. So thank you very much.
Thank you. It was very interesting paper, because we didn't, I think, all of us know anything about Rustaveli so far. Questions or comments for Lila's paper? May I ask you, Amber, please.
Yes, hi, thank you so much. That was really interesting. Just to see if I've got your argument right there, because I'm not familiar with that text at all. So you're saying that it was unsure whether he was actually quoting Plato directly, like because that quote itself couldn't be found in Plato. Did I get that part correct?
So the specialists were not sure. They thought that it was invention of Rustaveli or something like that. But I think he summarized, so he made some short resume of that, what can be found in Rustaveli, though it's very paradoxical, so to say, idea, yes, because it's very easy to refute it with empirical examples and so on and so on. It's impossible to prove it that if you do something bad, you harm yourself, but this idea we know we have it, Plato, and behind it, it's great metaphysical ideas and ontological ideas, but to prove it in life, it's almost impossible. But in this short form, I think we have it in Rustaveli. I am not the specialist of Rustaveli's poem at all, so Neoplatonic text and so on, this is my specialty, but I was really interested with this quote or this direct explicit mention of Plato in this poem, because we have many other so Neoplatonic and Areopagaitic ideas in this poem, so philosophical and so on. So that's why that was interesting.
Because I thought that, yeah, the idea of summarizing, like seeing that he's actually perhaps summarizing the teaching of Plato, I find that really fascinating, because I think sometimes we focus so much on, well, it's either an explicit reference or it's not. And I don't think literature works that way. You know, there's so much literary illusion and the way that writers will sometimes convey ideas. So I found that quite compelling. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you very, very much. And I just used this opportunity to say something about this summarizing and not direct quotes. So the same thing we have, for example, in the texts, which I know probably better, in Petrizi's 12th century commentaries on Proclus Elements of Theology, because we have there a lot of allusions, a lot of references to ancient Greek philosophical texts, but not very direct quotes, but still it is correct. So it's some kind of short summary of the ideas, probably something the same, yes. Thank you very much.
I absolutely agree, thank you.
Other question? May I ask you something?
Yes,
Rustaveli knew Greek.
who knows? Probably yes. Probably yes, because it is the epoch when it was the Hellenophilic epoch, so to say, yes. If it was written really in 12th century, this between 11th and first half of 13th century, so they knew it. And his contemporary people who translated a lot of Greek texts, they knew it. So I think probably yes.
So I think it will be easy for him to read Compedia or Anthologia and these kind of texts.
Yes, probably it is also possible that he read some kind of excerpts from Plato together. But you see, what we have in Georgian, it's formulated in another way, I think. It's only about that soul is injured, and this first part, the injury of body, is lost in those apophthegmata or short texts. That's why this is interesting, because it's more purely Platonic, so to say. Of course, maybe it's not true. Maybe he had some short version of this text, but somehow it's interesting to find real parallels in Plato which correspond to this context which we have in Rustaveli. Yes.
So we can suppose that he read some sources that were not easily accessible to other Georgian authors of this period.
I can't say that they were not accessible, because, you know, in that period, all Greek fathers, everything was translated many, many times. Unfortunately, we have very small evidence of ancient Greek texts, but we have really apology, translation and commentary of Proclus Elements, and their ancient Greek philosophers are mentioned, and really they are not only mentioned, but they are discussed. So all these Iamblichos and Plotinus and so, and Heraclitus and so on and so on. So it was possible to read them. This was this period between 11th century, 12th century, first half of 13th century, surely, yes. So it was possible. Aristotle was very popular and so on. Yes. Of course, it can be in Rustaveli, it could be the souls come from the second hand. It is possible, but somehow it corresponds to that what we have is dispersed in Platonic dialogues. Thank you.
Thank you. Donna?
Thank you. Very fascinating, especially about talking about the apophthegmata and the indirect. I was wondering, because I don't know anything about Georgian, would there have been an Armenian channel of exposure through the Armenian translations of Plato? Is there any kind of I don't know. It's not enough to say which dialogues are also, interfacing.
I am not, unfortunately, I have many relatives and friends, especially for old Armenian. I am not special for Armenian, but what I can say is that the translations of philosophical texts from Armenian, there are quite a lot of such translations, but very, very late. It's in 18th century. 18th century. It is a very interesting history in many cases. So something was translated from Greek into Georgian, then from Georgian into Armenian, then back from Armenian into Georgian, and so on and so on. So it's really intercultural, very interesting histories. Probably the same was with this apophthegmata or something Platonic text, but in this case, I think it really refers to that what we can find in Plato, and not in one text, but somehow in many of his dialogues.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Other question for Lila? Okay, thank you once again.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And now we move to the next speaker. The next speaker is Jaroslav Dimitriev from Ball State University. And the title of his paper is Plato's Political Philosophy in Early Byzantine Attitudes Toward Imperial Power.
Thank you, Georgios. Thank you very much, and good afternoon.
May I share your PDF archive?
Oh, yes, please do. Yes, that will be great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Especially since I have quite a lot of text there. Yes. Fantastic. Thank you very much. I very much hope that it's possible for the listeners, for the viewers to go through the texts, because I will be referring to different texts at the same time. My only excuse is that I get muted from time to time. I apologize for that. At any rate, why don't we start? And once again, good afternoon. And let me also start by thanking the organizers for their kind invitation and for eventually making it possible for me to speak at this conference on a very interesting and important topic of the influence of Plato's political philosophy on early Byzantine views on ideal rulership. Well, this topic has become particularly significant in the recent decade or so, in connection with an opinion advanced by quite a few people, and most vocally by Anthony Kaldelis, that in 6th century Constantinople there was an intellectual opposition to the Emperor Justinian, and even more to the monarchy as a political system. The adherents of this theory argue that early Byzantine intellectuals, Procopius, John Leadus, and Paul the Silentiary, among others, not only stood in opposition to the Emperor Justinian, but even urged for a republican form of government. When examining this topic, again, I will be referring to the texts from the handout, and I hope it is convenient. Again, this handout has been uploaded to the Dropbox, and I will be referring to numbers. Well, one of the problems with this theory is that others have seen the same early Byzantine authors as loyalists. For example, Bertolt Rubin and Johannes Imscher specifically put Procopius and Leadus in different camps. Rubin presented Leadus as one of Justinian's yes-men, and Imscher spoke of Leadus, Agapatus, and Paul the Silentiary as projecting a positive image of Justinian. Well, these scholars were using the same material, so that the recently advanced theory thus amounts to nothing more than personal interpretations. The other problem with this theory, and that is what I would like to focus on in my presentation today, is that both the stance of Byzantine intellectuals and the official ideology of the imperial rule in early Byzantium appear to have been more complex. On the one hand, early Byzantines indeed rationalized imperial power in legal terms. For example, Justinian I declared the emperor to be the source of law or animated.
Please unmute yourself. Sviatoslav?
Yes, that's the problem. For some reason which I do not know, I get muted from time to time. And this does not depend on me, but thank you for alerting me to this. What I was saying is that the other problem with this theory is that both the stance of Byzantine intellectuals and the official ideology of the imperial rule in Byzantium appear to have been more complex. And on the one hand, early Byzantines indeed rationalized imperial power in legal terms. For example, Justinian I declared the emperor to be the source of law or animated law and not bound by law. And these are numbers 1, 2, and 3 in the handout. And conversely, John Leadus, who is also from the 6th century, juxtaposed the law-abiding ruler with a tyrant and praised legal kinship as opposed to tyranny. And this is number 4. The contemporaneous anonymous dialogue on political science evidently articulated similar ideas, and this is number 5. Well, again, these are the opposite views, but what brings them together is that they operated within the same legal framework, that is, along the same lines. The image of a statesman or a ruler who, although a dispenser of law, was himself to be bound by law like his subjects, was certainly advanced by members of the Roman senatorial aristocracy, like Pliny the Younger in his panegyric for Emperor Trajan, and that is number 6. It had next to nothing about philosophy and paideia, and Pliny's main concern was safety of private property and keeping imperial power within moral and legal limits. Well, the latter meant the emperor who was obedient to laws like any other citizen and who had no more authority than a consul. Well, again, number 6. For the senatorial historiography, the emperor needed virtue only to make him abide by law and rule by law. His most important merit actually was just to be like his subjects. Tacitus' words, number 7, that Domitian's greatest fear was that the name of ordinary citizen would be extolled above that of the emperor, revealed social, legal, and political equality as the prime. Sorry, again, for some strange reason I get muted. I need to kind of demute myself. And number 8, Pliny praised Trajan not only for observing laws, but also for not putting himself above the Roman political elite. This was a wishful thinking, however, where the emperor respected laws depended only on his personal choice and attitude. The legal status of the emperor took its final shape when emperors were exempted from any legal compulsion, as Cassius Dio, also a member of Roman senatorial aristocracy, observed in retrospect, and that is number 9. Ulpian too declared that, I quote, "the emperor is not bound by laws," end of quote, and that is number 10. Complying with laws, therefore, made a part of the image of the good emperor as reflected, and these can be seen in number 11, by Severus Alexander, Theodosius III, and Valentinian. Theodosius II, and Valentinian III, and later by Justinian. Well, on the other hand, the Byzantine contemporaries of Justinian also rationalized imperial power in moral terms, and the origins of this approach can be traced back to Plato. It was Plato who offered the first consistent theoretical definition of what constituted ideal rule. He legitimized it with the ruler's personal and political qualities and with his responsibility to the people. However, Plato's views evolved over time, as is shown by comparing his Republic with the later statesmen and finally the laws which Plato wrote at the very end of his life. The Republic, number 12 in the handout, focused on the ruler's moral and educational qualities. Socrates, its leading character, insisted there would be no respite from evil unless, I quote, either philosophers become kings in our cities or the people who are now called kings and rulers become genuine and real philosophers. The end of quote. The ideal ruler of the Republic, therefore, ruled others just like he ruled himself. His self-rule was the practical expression of his reason, and the state was only an expansion of his self-government, for which he used the divine model, again, number 12. Hence he was the image of God. Since his own reason was law for him and his subjects, the ruler became animated law. Clement of Alexandria reflected on Plato's authorship of the concept animated law by ascribing it to Plato. Please see number 13, even though Plato never actually used it. But at any rate, for Plato and later Greeks, the ruler needed philosophy and 4 cardinal virtues: wisdom, courage, temperance, and moderation. Plato juxtaposed the wisdom of the ruler with human, written, or positive laws. These and cognate ideas evidently were in wide circulation at the time. We also see them in Isocrates, number 14, as well as Xenophon and Pseudo-Archytas of Tarentum, numbers 15 and 16. Plato's statesmen and laws were his reaction to the lack of that very ideal philosopher-ruler. At base, the statesman was still close to the Republic. The best form of government is
I'm afraid that we have to wait for Jaroslav to be reconnected. Somehow we lost him. So I propose to give him another couple of minutes in order to be reconnected. Jaroslav, make it. We will give him another 5 or 10 minutes to summarize and discuss with him. So the last speaker of the session is Hanna from Macquarie University, and the title of his paper is Plotinus and Augustine on Timaeus 37d and the temporality of eudaimonia.
Okay, can you still hear me okay? And can you see my screen?
Yes, of course.
Great. Okay, so I'm just going to read through an outline of my paper. You can find this outline as well as a draft of the paper as a whole on Dropbox. So the basic argument is this. To understand what Plotinus meant by eudaimonia, we need to make sense of how he mapped eudaimonia onto time. In doing so, he drew upon multiple sources: the moralized cosmology of time in the Timaeus, the present-mindedness of the Stoics, and the totalizing concept of eudaimonia found in Aristotle. Yet the Platonian position ends up offering a vision of eudaimonia that is distinct from these 3 sources. Here I am mostly interested in Ennead 1.5, on whether eudaimonia increases over time. where we find Plotinus citing Timaeus 37d as part of his Stoic-inflected argument about the need for eudaimonia to be present. Unlike the Stoics, however, Plotinus brings in his own Platonic notion of a timeless eternity, aion, to supplement his account of eudaimonia's presence. Ennead 1.5 should therefore be read in light not just of Ennead 1.4 on eudaimonia, but also of Ennead 3.7 on time and eternity. I will end by suggesting 3 basic points on which Augustine might disagree with his Platinian position on eudaimonia and time. In texts like the Confessions, the City of God, and the Gift of Perseverance, we find an account of temporality which is Platinian Platonic in how it treats the relation between time and this strange thing called eternity, but which also breaks with Plotinus in casting doubt upon the present as a worthy locus of eudaimonia in its truest sense. In the first section of my paper, I argued that the association of time with the moving image or icon of eternity, or of the aion, should at least initially be read in cosmological terms, since it segues into a discussion of the great astral cycle of the world year, and recall Anna Lazu's presentation on the Dance of the Stars yesterday. The Timaeus goes on to link cosmological time to certain moral qualities, with the result that the individual who lives in accordance with justice, dike, is one who has mastered their impulses and submitted themselves to a regularized form of life which mimics the predictable trajectory of their kindred star. At Timaeus 42a through d, we then find the blessed life, ion eudaimona, described as the culmination of this process that brings human temporal activity under the moral sway of celestial motion. One possible and quite fundamental link between time and eudaimonia has therefore been sketched out. In Ennead 3.7, Plotinus makes use of Timaeus 37d to clarify the meaning of aion as properly timeless eternity. This is important since the term aion can be used in so many different ways, from the quotidian age to the Valentinians' personified quasi-deities and beyond. Professor Gerson talked about this a little bit in his Living in Eternity paper. The Platinian sense of eternity will prove crucial for understanding later Platonic concepts of time, including many Christian ones. Augustine, for example, will treat eternity not as everlasting duration, but as strict timelessness. And this will inform Augustine's entire presentation of the time-eternity relationship. One underappreciated aspect of Plotinus's sense of eternity is the effect it has on his arguments concerning eudaimonia, primarily in Ennead 1.5, but also in the longer 1.4. To adequately grasp Plotinus on eudaimonia, we need to understand that he does not use the term to mean happiness in any simplistic or certainly hedonistic sense. Building on the relevant authorities, Corrigan, Gerson again, Macquarie, I read Plotinian eudaimonia as a kind of well-being reliant upon the virtuous activity of a rational agent, which enacts contemplation while also engaging in practical acts of virtue. Having offered rough sketches of Plotinian eternity and eudaimonia, I next turn to a closer reading of Ennead 1.5. The rhetoric of Ennead 1.5 reads as remarkably Stoic. Plotinus is at pains to emphasize that only present eudaimonia counts as eudaimonia proper. At times, he sounds like Marcus Aurelius in the Meditations, casting aside both past and future as irrelevant to the citadel of the present, which becomes the arena in which ataraxia is attained and eudaimonia is displayed. Memory of past well-being counts for nothing, and we should not even think of our lives in terms of moral progress, or prokope, proceeding from a worse past to a better future. Recall Gerson's talk again. Elpis is hardly a virtue, he said, for Plotinus. Being oriented to the future is the opposite of being oriented to eternity. As Emilson has argued, however, a present-focused approach to eudaimonia is not exclusive to the Stoics. It can also be found in the Epicureans and many other post-Aristotelian philosophers. As Edo suggested, the present alone might have been the locus of happiness for much of ancient thought as we know it. Gradually, then, it becomes clear that Plotinus is not really a Stoic. In Ennead 1.5.7, he connects his presentism to an idea of eternity that would be familiar to any reader of Ennead 3.7. His introduction of timeless eternity into the discussion separates him from his Stoic interlocutors. By introducing timeless eternity into the discussion, Plotinus clarifies that the presence of eudaimonia has to do not just with a single slice of time, for example, this present that is happening right now, but more so with an aion that stands outside of time, and yet may have a special relationship to the present. Plotinus's position on time and eudaimonia therefore sounds Stoic, but is not truly Stoic in its underlying mechanics, thanks to his importation of a concept of timeless eternity into a present-minded account of what it means to attain eudaimonia. While I won't have time to explore them all here, there are some corollaries that suggest themselves on the basis of what has just been said. Number one, the location of eudaimonia in eternity, not time, depends upon the ability of the human being to actualize the undescended nous within, which is also beyond time. Number two, as Rist and Macquarie have shown, there are potential problems that arise from the above claim, especially when Plotinus argues that someone who has attained eudaimonia, we might call them a Platinian sage, cannot lose it simply because they get sick or fall under a magical spell. In other words, their cognitive functions can be impaired, but this does not undermine their noetic attainment of eudaimonia. Number three, this could also cause problems in light of the Aristotelian description of eudaimonia, according to which the eudaimonic title should only be bestowed on the basis of an individual's entire life, rather than one moment or even a series of moments. As Cooper reminds us, Aristotle might even include the future fate of one's children in the reckoning up of one's eudaimonia. In other words, there might be a retrospective element, meaning that eudaimonia could only be ascribed to individuals long after they and their children were dead. Such concerns risk reawakening the debate about how to translate eudaimonia. Cooper's flourishing could, for instance, be used to indicate that eudaimonia is a rather long-term proposition, as opposed to the momentary appeal of certain conceptions of happiness. Augustine will grant it a longer term still. So in the final section of my paper, I offer 3 Augustinian rejoinders to the Platinian approach. As a brief disclaimer, I should say that the obvious place to look for an Augustinian perspective on eudaimonia would be his early dialogue De Beata Vita, given that the phrase Beata Vita sometimes gets used as a Latinate equivalent alongside Beatitudo for eudaimonia. However, the most obvious place to look is not always the most relevant. The extreme earliness of De Beata Vita, a Ciceronian, eclectic, and possibly Stoic-leaning text, renders it an incomplete depiction of Augustine's response to the discourse surrounding eudaimonia, which we can glimpse more fully in later works, like the Confessions, like the City of God, and even very late anti-Pelagian texts, like De Dono Perseverantiae. In works both early and late, Augustine largely agrees with Plotinus that eternity cannot be mere everlastingness, or infinite duration, but must be strict timelessness. This is the brightest thread connecting Ennead 3.7 to Confessions 11. Ennead 1.5, however, is not a very Augustine-friendly text. The main reason is that it rhetorically relies so much on a Stoic-sounding presentism concerning what counts as real and what it means to live well or flourish. While I don't have time to address all of the particulars here, I would suggest 3 possible rejoinders. Number 1. Augustine would read arguments like that found in Timaeus 37d as primarily cosmological and only secondarily moral. And indeed, he uses a Latin translation of the Timaeus mostly as a cosmological reference in the City of God. But he rejects accounts of temporality that reduce it to celestial motion, and so his goal is not so much to return to the heart of Timaeus 37d as it is to rethink objective time on a different cosmological basis, namely that of Genesis 1 as read through the lens of creatio ex nihilo. Number 2, as I've already hinted at above, Augustine would resist any Stoic framing of the question of the temporality of eudaimonia. In Confessions 11, City of God 13, and elsewhere, he is skeptical of the integrity of the present moment within time. As a result, he cannot adopt Stoic presentism about eudaimonia or about time itself, even if he is willing to adopt Stoic language in other texts or other contexts, as Sarah Byers has shown. Perhaps this reticence makes him somewhat of an outlier compared to the other post-Aristotelian thinkers listed by Emilson. Recall Josie McCaskey's paper on Exiphanes here as well. Ultimately, Augustine addresses the future not in terms of moral progress, but in terms of what he calls, especially in the text of the same name, De Dono Perseverantiae, the gift of perseverance. He is not so enamored of the idea that we can simply add up units of virtue over time and at some point attain eudaimonia. Instead, on the basis of his reading of 1 Corinthians 10:12, he is worried about backsliding. That is, the possibility that those who think they are piling up moral virtue or happiness or well-being or flourishing over time may turn out to be sadly mistaken when the final accounts are tallied. For Augustine, that reckoning can only be eschatological. Accordingly, eudaimonia is also eschatological. He therefore leaves us with a kind of temporal anxiety, as opposed to Stoic ataraxia or its not-so-Stoic Platinian substitute. I'll conclude with a brief final suggestion. Curiously enough, Augustine's later position, which replaces progress with perseverance, might be more reminiscent of the Aristotelian idea that eudaimonia should be ascribed to life as a whole, rather than to any one moment or to any chronological portion of one's life. The claim that one's eudaimonia depends on post-mortem evaluations, for example, the aforementioned fate of one's children, could also be profitably compared to Augustine's notion that it will be impossible to determine who has truly persevered to the end until the end arrives, which for him means not just the death of myself or my children, but the end of cosmological time itself. Thank you. This is my eudaimonic table that I made to try to simplify my reading of these figures, but I won't belabor the point by reading it out to you, but you can check it out on Dropbox if you're interested.
Okay, thank you very much, Sean. So we have time for some questions, and then I will give back the floor to Sviatoslav in order to conclude his paper. I saw him now, he is with us. So, questions or remarks for Sean, please? Christian, yeah?
Yeah, thanks, Sean. I'm interested to hear how you would characterize the difference between Plotinus's conception of eudaimonia and Aristotle's in the Nicomachean Ethics. I'm thinking especially about Aristotle's discussion of the role that contemplation or theoria plays in eudaimonia in Book 10 of the Ethics, and how that might be different from what you were talking about with eternity in Plotinus and nous and so forth. So I'm sorry, just to repeat, how are the two different, Aristotle's account of eudaimonia and Plotinus's in those two respects?
Right. Well, I think with respect to the association between eudaimonia and theoria, they're very similar. So I certainly don't mean to suggest that Plotinus is kind of anti-Aristotelian, but I'm thinking of it more in terms of how a scholar like Emilson will kind of sketch this landscape of what he calls post-Aristotelian thinkers, right? So you have Stoics, you have Neoplatonists, but they're all kind of Aristotelian, right? They all have absorbed so much of these basic underlying ideas, and then we kind of have to place them on a spectrum, right? Because they don't agree on everything, even though they kind of might share some fundamental understandings. And so in that case, I would say that, yeah, we can put Plotinus and Aristotle pretty darn close together on the association between contemplation and eudaimonia. It's just that how they express that in terms of temporality, I think, is pretty different. And here I'm partially relying on some secondary scholarship on Aristotle that really emphasizes this idea that Aristotelian eudaimonia has to be totalizing. And by totalizing, I mean it has to be has to count for like the whole life of the person, right? Taken as a whole in some sense. And so that makes Aristotelian eudaimonia a little bit different from maybe the Xiphness theme that we keep coming back to again, which is more of like this moment of understanding, right? This like flash where in the present moment you kind of touch upon eternity and enter into some new state, right? And it doesn't seem like that's what's going on in Aristotelian eudaimonia, at least on my reading and the reading of Cooper and some others. Whereas in Plotinus, it really does kind of seem like once you've trained your soul in such a way that you are able to kind of commune with your own undescended nous on the regular, you can't lose it, right? And that connects to that other point about how even if a sorcerer bewitches you, casts a spell on you, and you aren't thinking clearly, you still haven't lost your eudaimonia, because that's only affecting your lower self, right? And your higher noetic self is still perfectly in a perfectly eudaimonic state. And that just seems pretty different from that retrospective aspect of Aristotle, right? Where we're almost much more skeptical about eudaimonia, right? That even as someone who looks like a wise philosopher or a wise sage who's engaged in a life of contemplation and practical virtue, it might turn out that because their children were horrible or something, they actually weren't as eudaimonic as we thought. And I think that skepticism finds its way into Augustine, doesn't find its way as much into Plotinus, who I think wants to kind of build defenses against it, if that makes sense. And the defense he builds against it is kind of that citadel of the present, which again is very reminiscent of the Stoics, even if he's not really a Stoic, but they share that in common.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Amber?
Yeah, hi, Sean. Thank you so much. Anything on Augustine always I find fascinating. Excuse me if this is a very stupid question. Just blame it on the fact that it's past midnight here, okay? But I'm really interested in what you touched on, and also Lloyd Gerson mentioned about hope in the Christian tradition, and that being very focused on future well-being, which was not what, not being in the present, taking you away from the present. My question is this: with obviously, the rejection of a lot of Christian doctrine in modern times, and also the modern explosion of self-help books on living in the moment, so such as like Eckhart Tolle on the power of now. Do you think that this could be like a modern embracing of Platonic ideas and a rejection of the Christian ideal of future hope? Because you mentioned that temporal anxiety, and I found that very interesting with Augustine too, because there does seem to be, very much like, you don't know how your soul is, and that kind of whole backsliding idea. So yeah, I'm just kind of curious as to whether you can see some kind of modern Platonic ideal there.
Yes, and I'm going to answer this in a way that will seem horribly self-promoting, but I swear I mean it as a joke. If you want to know more about this, read chapter 4 of my book.
Which I
got
into... So it wasn't a stupid question. Okay.
No, it's very, I think, relevant. If we're trying to think of ways of why these debates about temporality and does the present really exist according to ancient philosophy, how they're relevant to today, I think you just hit upon it, right? It's the mindfulness movement. Whether you're for it or against it, that's a separate thing, but it's kind of a live question for both advocates and detractors of that movement. I would frame it less as a Neoplatonic revival, right? I think that would be kind of mean to Plotinus and all the other cool Neoplatonists. It's really more of a Stoic revival, right? And maybe that's mean to the Stoics, but you do see that, right? Modern Stoicism movements, people getting really into kind of Marcus Aurelius style, simplistic emphases on the present moment, right? And this is big in Silicon Valley and places like that, right? This is a real industry. And the difference between that, I would say, between Marcus Aurelius and Plotinus, and this kind of comes through in that table I kind of briefly flashed before everyone's eyes, is that for Marcus, it's really just the present, right? The past and future don't exist. What matters is what's happening right now. And so everything is hanging on your sort of mental integrity in the moment. Plotinus shares a surface level Stoic rhetoric, as I tried to demonstrate, but it's not because the present is the be all end all. It's because, as Gerson kind of hinted at yesterday, the present is more than the past and the future are, but it doesn't have as much being as timeless eternity, right? But it is hierarchically kind of closer, it seems, for Plotinus to the aion, right? To timeless eternity. And so we can think, I think, we can think of the present for him as a gateway to eternity. And so that's what makes it matter more than the past and the future. But the Stoic stops before that, right? Or at least the kind of cookie cutter version of Stoicism that gets picked up today. They don't really care about timeless eternity, right? They just want mental stability in the moment so that they, if they fired 500 staffers yesterday, they don't have to feel bad about it today, right? Because it's like, well, that's water under the bridge. And all I need to do is kind of focus on what I can change and what I can't, that sort of thing. And Augustine, as you know, is just like totally operating on a different wavelength.
Yeah.
For Augustine, you should be anxious, not just about things you've done yesterday, but maybe things you haven't even done, but that you might do, right? So it's a different approach to mental health, we might say.
Brilliant, thank you. And what was the name of the book?
It's called On Time, Change, History, and Conversion.
Beautiful, thank you.
Thanks.
Joe, a quick question, please, because
Sure.
I think Jaroslav is here, and I will give him another 5 minutes to conclude or present his argument briefly. Yeah.
Thank you, and thank you, Sean, for that presentation. That was great. And like Amber, I was struck by the phrase temporal anxiety, and I'm wondering if you think that's what's at play in Plato's Phaedo dialogue, where you've got Socrates questioning his entire life there when he's got hours to live, and practicing the art of poetry rather than philosophy. In other words, translating Aesop's fables into verse, etc.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I don't think I have an illuminating answer, especially because I want to hand the baton on here. Maybe I can just suggest an interesting comparison. In the Life of Augustine, written by Posidonius of Calama, we get an account, as I'm sure you know, of Augustine's final days, which are engaged not in theological speculation, but rather he lays in bed as he's dying, and he has the Psalms, certain Psalms, put up in big sort of like posters on his wall so that he can read the Psalms and weep as he dies. And that's a form of engagement with poetry in the face of death. But I think maybe a bit, I don't want to say grimmer, but certainly it's an austere engagement with poetry in the face of death that you find in Augustine as well.
That's great. I wasn't aware of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean, for the very vivid presentation. And I would like to give a second chance to Jaroslav. I hope that technology will support him. And I think we have, Jaroslav, another 5 or 10 minutes to try to present your argument and reply to some questions or comments. Please unmute yourself. We are not able to hear you. Jaroslav, could you hear me? Unmute yourself, please. Oh, we're not able to hear you. I think that you should change the audio source somehow.
I should change what?
No, now we can hear you. Okay.
Now you can hear you. Well, that's very nice. Thank you. Well, I really don't want to put too much strain on anybody in this session, and thank you for your patience. Let me be very brief. What I was trying to say was that usually the early Byzantine political life is being seen as a continuation of Roman imperial political life. That is, the attitude towards the emperor was purely in legalistic terms. And hence the ideas of early Byzantine political thinkers like Procopius, like leaders, like John the Semantiary, were seen as continuation of senatorial historiography. And that's a very interesting thing, because this is one of the very few points when such people as Anthony Kaldelis and Avril Cameron actually joined together. They fight on essentially everything, but here they agree that these early Byzantine authors were essentially continuing the attitudes of Roman senatorial historiography. What I was trying to say was that it's more complex than that. Well, obviously, there was some continuation of Roman senatorial historiography in the sense that the emperor was urged to abide by laws, so it was legalistic. But at the same time, there was also the revival of Platonic idea of what ideal rulership should be. And that, of course, was based on moral perception of rule and on the presence of wisdom, philosophy, and moral virtues. And therefore, what I'm saying is that the attitude of early Byzantine intellectuals to imperial power appears to have been more complex than typically presented. Well, certainly, early Byzantine authors shared the Roman senatorial view that rationalized the imperial power in legal terms, but at the same time, and that's what I'm arguing for, they also pointed out that the ruler had to have high moral qualities, the necessary imperial virtues rooted in wisdom and philosophy, and thus they expressed the ideas that eventually went back to Plato. And my argument also includes the point that this reassessment not only casts a new light on the survival of Platonic philosophy in early Byzantium, in particular in the field of political philosophy, but I also suggest that the early Byzantine elite was developing a new political identity on the basis of both Greek and Roman political philosophies. That is, it was not just Roman political identity, it was also kind of a mix of Roman legalistic political philosophy and Greek philosophical political philosophy. And hence we see this departure from Roman imperial political establishment to creating something new. And that allows us to speak of Byzantium as a separate political entity. So that was the argument. I'm sorry, kind of like summarize it very, very briefly, but that was the point. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. The argument is very, very interesting, I think. Are there any questions for Stanislav or comments?
I perfectly understand. That's been quite some time for this
No,
session.
I would like to ask you something. Do you think do you tell us something more on the revival of the Platonic political tradition? According to your view, Jaroslav, that means that 6th century Byzantines read Plato, or it was something like a Neoplatonic reading of Plato's political philosophy?
From what I know, it was both. That is, it was classical Plato, if I may say so. It was also kind of interpretation, Neoplatonic interpretation. Actually, Plato was quite well known. Plato was studied very much like Aristotle in major schools, Alexandria, Antioch, of course, Constantinople. We have big names. And we have people who refer to either themselves or other people taking lectures. For example, John Leaders, whom I mentioned quite a number of times in this presentation, he referred to himself as taking lectures in Platonic philosophy when he was in Constantinople, when he was kind of waiting to get a job.
In Platonic political philosophy, or in Platonic philosophy in general?
But it was reinterpretation of Plato's philosophy. I mean, of course, Plato was political philosopher among other things. Plato was philosopher in many senses. But what was taking place was that they were taking classes in Plato's philosophy and then were applying his ideas to reality of the 6th century Constantinople. Right, so of course they could not just take lesson from Plato and kind of plant it into their own time. It had to be adjusted. So in this sense, you might refer to it as Neoplatonic. But it was also more complex than that, because among other things, what I was saying in my presentation was Plato's ideas themselves evolved over time. That is, he expresses different views, say, in the Republic, then in the Statesman, then in the Laws, and the Byzantines were picking up what they considered to be more relevant to their current realities.
Thank you. Other question? So if there is no other question, I would like to thank you for being present in this session. And thank you once again, all of you. And in 20 minutes, we have the final session, which is dedicated to Professor Corrigan plenary lecture. So see you in 20 minutes.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.